It was supposed to be one of those evenings you cherish forever, our 10th wedding anniversary. I had taken the day off from work, something I almost never did, to make it special for Emma, my wife. I spent hours preparing everything. Her favorite dinner, pan-seared chicken with creamy mushroom sauce, paired with a bottle of Merlot from a small vineyard we'd visited during a trip to Sonoma years ago. I even dug out the old playlist from our wedding, full of songs that once felt like the soundtrack of our lives together. The table was set with candles flickering softly, casting a warm glow over the room. Everything was ready. All that was left was for Emma to come home. She had texted earlier in the day, saying she'd be a little late because of work, but it didn't bother me at first. She had a demanding job at a law firm here in Chicago, and late nights were common. But as the minutes stretched into hours, my excitement started to wane. By 8 p.m., the candles had burned down to nubs, and the food was cold. I sent her a text. "Everything okay?" It showed as delivered, but no response came. Around 8:30, I called her. She picked up after 2 rings. "Hey, Emma," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Are you on your way? I got dinner ready." Her voice came through rushed and distracted. "Oh, hey, Ryan. I'm still at the office. Big case coming up. I'll be home soon, okay?" Something about her tone gave me pause. "Are you sure you're okay? You sound tense." She hesitated just for a second before brushing it off. "Just tired, that's all. We'll talk when I get home." "Okay. I've got to go." The call ended before I could respond. When she finally walked through the door close to 10 p.m., she looked frazzled, but not in the way I expected. Her makeup was flawless, and her hair, though slightly tousled, didn't seem like it had been through the grind of a long workday. She froze when she saw the table, her eyes darting between the candles, the food, and me. "Oh no, Ryan, I completely forgot," she blurted out, dropping her purse on the counter. "I'm so sorry." "It's okay," I lied, forcing a smile, even though disappointment weighed heavily on my chest. "We can celebrate now." She shook her head quickly. "No. Imagzosta. Let's do something tomorrow? Okay." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Sure." That night, as I lay in bed next to her, I tried to shake off the nagging feeling that something was off. It wasn't just that she'd forgotten, it was how detached she seemed, like she wasn't even trying to make it up to me. The next day, I made a reservation at a charming Italian restaurant downtown, La Rosa, a place we used to frequent back when life was simpler. I thought it might help rekindle something between us. The cozy atmosphere, the familiar smell of freshly baked bread, and the soft hum of Sinatra in the background all felt perfect. Emma seemed more relaxed when we sat down, flashing me the smile that once made my heart race. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe we could get back to that place. She excused herself to the restroom after we placed our orders. While I waited, the waiter came over with the bottle of wine I'd ordered. He gave me a polite nod as he uncorked it. "That's an excellent choice," he said. "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound casual. "It's a special night, our 10th anniversary." His expression shifted slightly, just enough for me to notice. His brow furrowed, and he hesitated as if he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure if he should. "Is something wrong?" I asked. He glanced around, lowering his voice. "I don't mean to intrude, but wasn't your wife here last night?" I froze. "What do you mean?" He nodded toward a small table near the window. "She was sitting right there with another man. I remember because they left just after 7. My stomach churned. "Are you sure it was her?" "Yes," he said firmly. "I remember her, because she asked for the same dessert she always orders when she's here, the tiramisu." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Emma had told me she'd been at the office until 9 p.m. the night before. If she'd left the restaurant at 7 o'clock, where had she been for the next 2 hours? When she returned to the table, I forced myself to act normal. "Sorry about that," she said, sitting down and reaching for her water. "No problem," I replied, keeping my tone light. "So, how was work yesterday? You mentioned it was a long day." She blinked, caught off guard by the question. Yeah, it was brutal. I didn't leave until 9. I nodded slowly, the waiter's words echoing in my head. Must have been exhausting. Her smile faltered for a moment before she recovered. "Yeah, late nights are killer, but they come with the territory." I didn't press further, but my mind was racing. Later that night, as we walked through the door, she let out a tired sigh. "I'm going to bed," she mumbled, not even glancing at me as she headed for the bedroom. I stood in the living room, staring at the remnants of the anniversary dinner I'd reheated for myself earlier. Something wasn't adding up. The waiter's words, the 2 missing hours, her distracted demeanor. It all pointed to one thing, a truth I wasn't ready to face but couldn't ignore. As Emma slept soundly beside me, I grabbed her phone off the nightstand. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. I wasn't the kind of man who believed in invading someone's privacy, but the nagging doubt had grown too loud to ignore. What I found would shatter the world I thought I knew. The screen lit up in the darkness, casting a faint glow across the room. Emma's breathing was steady, her face peaceful as she slept beside me. But my heart was pounding. I navigated to her messages first. The usual chats were there, texts with her coworkers, a group thread with her family, and a few conversations with friends. Nothing seemed out of place. For a moment, I felt ridiculous. Maybe I was overthinking. But just as I was about to put the phone down, I noticed a folder tucked away at the bottom of her messaging app, a little icon labeled Archived. I clicked it. The first name that popped up was Daniel, someone I'd never heard her mention before. My gut twisted. The chat thread wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. A single message at the top stopped me cold. "Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you." I scrolled up, my eyes scanning the exchange. They'd been meeting for weeks, and the conversations were filled with plans, playful teasing, and far too many details for me to pretend this was innocent. My chest tightened as I read, "You look stunning in that dress. The way you smiled at me at dinner. I can't wait to see you again." And then the most recent message. "Are we still on for Thursday? Same place." Thursday, the night of our anniversary. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I exited the messages and opened her photos. There, buried among pictures of us and random snapshots of work documents, were a handful of images she'd taken in secret. Selfies of her in outfits I'd never seen, posing in ways that were meant for someone else's eyes. My throat felt dry. I didn't know what to do. Should I wake her up and confront her? Demand an explanation? But deep down, I already knew the truth. The waiter's words, the missing hours, the messages. All of it painted a clear picture. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, staring at the wall as 1,000 memories flashed through my mind. Our first date, our wedding day, the lazy Sundays spent binge-watching TV shows. It all felt like it belonged to someone else's life. How we ended up here? The next morning, Emma acted like everything was fine. She hummed softly as she brewed coffee, glancing at me with a smile. "You're up early," she said, pouring a cup and sliding it across the counter to me. "Yeah, couldn't sleep," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She didn't press, and I couldn't tell if she noticed the tension between us or if she was just that good at pretending. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions at work, barely focusing on the tasks in front of me. Every time my phone buzzed with a message, I flinched, half expecting it to be something that would confirm my worst fears. On Thursday evening, I made up an excuse about working late and left the house earlier than usual. My plan wasn't fully formed, but I knew one thing. I needed to see it for myself. I drove to the restaurant where the waiter had said he'd seen her. La Rosa's warm lights glowed invitingly, and the faint hum of conversation and clinking glasses spilled out onto the street as I parked a block away. I waited in my car, the minutes dragging by as I watched the entrance. And then, just after 7:30, she arrived. Emma stepped out of a black sedan, her laughter floating into the air as she turned to the man beside her. Daniel. He was tall, well-dressed, with a confident smile that made my stomach churn. I watched as they walked inside together, her hand brushing against his arm in a way that felt too familiar. Every part of me wanted to storm in and confront them right there, to demand answers and make her face what she'd done. But instead, I stayed in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. About an hour later, they emerged, laughing and leaning into each other. Daniel opened the car door for her, and she slid inside with a smile. I followed them, staying far enough back to avoid suspicion. They didn't go to his place or some hidden spot in the city. Instead, they drove to a hotel, a sleek, modern building with tinted windows and valet parking. I watched as they disappeared inside, my worst fears now undeniable. It felt like the world had stopped spinning. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, torn between rage and heartbreak. The woman I had built my life with, the woman I had trusted with everything, had been leading a double life right under my nose. When I finally drove home that night, I felt numb. I didn't know how to confront her, or even if I could. But one thing was certain. The life we'd built together was never going to be the same. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I was walking through quicksand. Emma was already up, moving around the kitchen like it was just another day. I could hear her humming softly, the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. But I couldn't enjoy it, not after what I'd seen the night before. Her walking into that hotel with Daniel, their casual familiarity, the way her hand brushed against his arm. It all played in my head on an endless loop. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of it. Was there a version of this that wasn't as bad as it looked? Maybe they were just co-workers meeting to discuss a project. But deep down, I knew better. I knew what I saw. When I finally emerged from the bedroom, Emma greeted me with a bright smile, like nothing was wrong. "Morning," she chirped, handing me a cup of coffee. "You slept in? Everything okay?" I forced a smile, my hands trembling as I took the cup. "Yeah, just tired. Long week." "Tell me about it," she said with a sigh, sipping her coffee. "Daniel's been piling on the work lately. He's such a perfectionist." Daniel. Even hearing his name made my stomach churn. For the next few days, I tried to act normal, but it was like living in a nightmare. Every time Emma smiled at me, every time she kissed me goodbye, I wondered if she was thinking about him. Every time her phone buzzed, I wondered if it was Daniel. I needed answers. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. The guy's name was Rick, and he came recommended by a co-worker who'd been through a messy divorce. He had a gruff voice, a no-nonsense demeanor, and a promise to find the truth, no matter how ugly it was. This could take a while, Rick warned me during our first meeting. "I don't care how long it takes," I said. "I just need to know." But it didn't take long. Within days, Rick had everything: photos, timestamps, even audio recordings. Emma and Daniel weren't just meeting up for dinner or hotel rendezvous. They had a full-blown routine. Weekly lunches, weekend meetups, and even late-night phone calls when she thought I was asleep. The details were devastating. Rick showed me a stack of photos. Emma and Daniel sitting close at a cafe, her laughing at something he said. Them walking into his apartment together, her hand lightly touching his back. And then the one that broke me. The two of them kissing in his car, their faces lit by the glow of a streetlight. "She's been doing this for months," Rick said, his tone heavy. "I'm sorry, man." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Months. While I was sitting at home, trusting her, loving her, she was out there with him. The breaking point came on a Friday. I came home early, the folder Rick had given me tucked under my arm. I felt sick, my heart pounding as I rehearsed what I was going to say. Emma was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I walked in, her face lighting up. "You're home early," she said, setting her glass down. "Everything okay?" I didn't respond. Instead, I walked to the kitchen, grabbed the folder, and dropped it on the coffee table in front of her. "What's this?" she asked, frowning. "Open it," I said, my voice flat. She hesitated, glancing up at me, but eventually picked up the folder. As she flipped through the photos, her face drained of color. "Well, where did you get these?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "That doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that I know. About Daniel. About everything." Her hands trembled as she set the photos down. "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice barely audible. "Really?" I said, my voice rising. "Because it looks like you've been lying to me for months. It looks like you've been sneaking around with him, meeting him at hotels, going to his apartment. So go ahead, Emma. Tell me what it really is." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Tears welled in her eyes, and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she finally said, her voice muffled. "But it did," I snapped. "You let it happen. You chose him, Emma. Every time you snuck out, every time you lied to me, you chose him." "I'm sorry," she sobbed, reaching for me. but I stepped back, shaking my head. Don't, I said, my voice cold. You don't get to apologize and make this go away. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it. For the rest of the night, I avoided her. She tried to talk to me, begged me to let her explain, but I couldn't even look at her. I slept in the guest room, staring at the ceiling all night, wondering how we got here. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed a bag and left, telling her I needed space. As I drove away, my mind raced with questions. Was this the end? Could I ever forgive her? Did I even want to? One thing was clear. The life I thought we had was gone, shattered beyond repair. Leaving the house was supposed to give me clarity, but it felt more like walking into a fog. I stayed with my buddy Eric for a while, crashing on his couch and trying to sort through the wreckage of my life. He didn't ask too many questions, just handed me a beer and let me sit in silence. You want to talk about it? I'm here, he said one night as we sat on his back porch. I didn't answer at first, just stared out at the dark yard. But eventually, the words came spilling out. The photos, the lies, Emma's sobbing apologies. Man, I'm sorry, Eric said, shaking his head. That's brutal. You deserve better. I nodded, but his words didn't feel real. Deserve better? What did that even mean? I couldn't just flip a switch and stop loving her, no matter what she'd done. For the first few days, Emma called and texted constantly. Please come home, one message read. We need to talk. I'll explain everything. Another said, I know I messed up, but I love you. Can we at least try to fix this? I didn't respond. I couldn't. Every time I saw her name on my phone, it felt like a punch to the gut. But then one night she stopped calling. The silence should have been a relief, but it only made things worse. What was she doing? Was she with him? The thought made my stomach churn. Rick's words haunted me. This has been going on for months. Months. While I was planning date nights and thinking about our future, she was sneaking around with Daniel. How many times had she looked me in the eye and lied? Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. Late one night, I drove back to our house. Her car was in the driveway, and all the lights were off. I sat there for a long time, debating whether to go inside. Part of me wanted to burst through the door, demand answers, force her to admit everything. But instead, I just sat there, staring at the house that used to feel like home. The next morning, I decided to take a different approach. I called Rick again, asking him to dig deeper. I need to know if she's still seeing him, I said. Rick agreed, and within a week, he had an answer. She's not meeting him anymore, he said. At least, not that I can tell. But she's been staying home a lot, keeping to herself. The news didn't bring me much comfort. Maybe she was avoiding him out of guilt, or maybe she'd just found another way to hide it. Eventually, Emma's silence broke. She sent me a long email, pouring her heart out. She admitted to the affair, saying it started as a harmless friendship and spiraled into something more. She said she felt unappreciated, that Daniel made her feel seen and valued in a way I didn't. I'm not blaming you, she wrote. What I did was wrong, and I take full responsibility. But I need you to understand why it happened. Her words hit me like a freight train. I'd spent weeks building a wall of anger and resentment, convincing myself that she was the villain in all of this. But now, cracks were forming in that wall. Had I really been neglecting her? Had I failed to show her how much she meant to me? I wanted to hate her, to write her off as selfish and cruel. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Relationships are messy, complicated things, and ours had clearly been broken long before Daniel entered the picture. I spent days agonizing over what to do. Part of me wanted to fight for her, to prove that we could come back from this. But another part of me, the part that had seen those photos, heard those recordings, knew I might never be able to trust her again. The turning point came during a conversation with my mom. She was one of the only people I'd told about the affair, and she listened patiently as I poured out my frustrations. Do you still love her? She asked. I hesitated. I don't know. I think so. But how do I know if that's enough? She smiled sadly. Love isn't always enough. Trust, respect, commitment, those things matter just as much. Without them, love can't survive. Her words stuck with me. I realized I didn't just want Emma to love me. I needed her to respect me, to choose me, to be honest with me. And right now, I didn't know if she could do that. A few days later, I called Emma and asked to meet. We sat across from each other at a quiet cafe, the air thick with tension. She looked tired, her eyes puffy and red, like she hadn't slept in days. "I'm sorry," she said as soon as we sat down. "I know I hurt you, and if I could take it back, I would. I believe you," I said. "But I need to know something. If this hadn't come out, would you have stopped? Or would you have kept lying to me?" She looked down, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with her coffee cup. "I don't know," she admitted. "I told myself I would stop, but I don't know if I really would have." Her honesty was like a knife to the chest, but I appreciated it. At least she wasn't trying to sugarcoat things anymore. "I need time," I said finally. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I'm not ready to walk away just yet." Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait as long as it takes." As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least now, I had a choice. Time didn't heal everything, but it gave me clarity. After the cafe meeting with Emma, I went back to Eric's and tried to figure out what life without her would look like. At first, the thought terrified me. She'd been my world for so long. But as the days passed, I started to see the cracks that had been there all along. Emma was the love of my life, but somewhere along the way, we'd lost sight of each other. Maybe it was my fault for not being present enough, or maybe it was hers for seeking validation in someone else. Either way, our foundation had been shaky for longer than I wanted to admit. I threw myself into work, into the gym, into reconnecting with friends I'd neglected over the years. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like my own person again. The fog of heartbreak began to lift, and for the first time in weeks, I could imagine a future where I wasn't defined by Emma's betrayal. But then, just as I was finding my footing, she showed up at Eric's place. It was late, and I was in the middle of a movie when there was a knock at the door. Eric opened it, and there she was, standing on the porch with tears in her eyes. "Can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric looked at me, his expression cautious. I nodded, and he stepped aside to let her in. We sat in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken words. She looked different, more fragile, like the weight of what she'd done had finally caught up to her. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see," she said, wringing her hands. "But I needed to tell you something." I braced myself, half expecting her to drop another bombshell. "I've been going to therapy," she said. "I'm trying to understand why I did what I did, why I threw away the best thing in my life. And I realized something. It wasn't about you. It was about me." Her voice cracked, and she wiped a tear from her cheek. "I've spent so much of my life trying to be perfect, trying to live up to everyone else's expectations. But I never stopped to think about what I wanted, who I really was. And when Daniel came along, I don't know, he made me feel like I could escape all of that. Like I could be someone else, just for a little while." She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "I'm not telling you this to excuse what I did. I needed you to know that it wasn't your fault. You didn't deserve any of this." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I've been carrying this weight, blaming myself for not being enough. Hearing her admit that it wasn't about me, it was freeing in a way. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said finally. "What you did broke me, Emma. It broke us." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. And if you can't forgive me, I'll accept that. But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right, even if it's too late." For the first time in weeks, I saw the Emma I'd fallen in love with. The vulnerable, honest, imperfect woman who'd captured my heart all those years ago. But I also saw the reality of what she'd done, the trust she'd shattered. And I knew I couldn't go back, no matter how much I wanted to. "I think we need to let each other go," I said, my voice shaking. "We've both got a lot to figure out, and I don't think we can do that together." She nodded, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of my words had physically hit her. "I get it," she whispered. I hope you find happiness, even if it's not with me." We sat there in silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of Eric's old clock. Then she stood, gave me one last tearful look, and walked out the door. I didn't chase her this time. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I moved out of Eric's and into my own place, a small but cozy apartment across town. I started going on dates again, though nothing serious. For the first time in years, I was focused on myself, on what I wanted, on who I wanted to be. Emma and I stayed in touch, though our conversations were few and far between. She seemed to be doing better, too. Therapy was helping her, and she even mentioned taking up painting again, something she used to love but had abandoned years ago. One day, I got a letter from her. It was short, just a few lines, but it said everything it needed to. Thank you for letting me go. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, but I think it's what we both needed. I'll always love you, and I'll always be sorry. But I'm finally learning to love myself, too. And for that, I'll always be grateful to you. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer, unsure if I'd ever read it again. But as I sat there, staring out the window at the city below, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Emma was my greatest love, and she was also my greatest heartbreak. But life moves on, and so would I. For the first time in a long time, I was ready for whatever came next.